She saved the king who rules the land that exiled her kind. She pulled him back from death with bare hands and a gift she'd spent a lifetime hiding, Messine, then left without asking for a single thing in return. Not his name, not his gratitude, not even confirmation that he'd live. That's not weakness. That's a woman who learned a long time ago that the world takes everything you offer and calls it payment for the privilege of existing. Stay with me to the end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The rain came sideways off the northern ridgeline, the kind that didn't just soak you, but got inside you, into the joints, into the jaw, into the particular hollowness behind the sternum that Kalina Voss had stopped pretending wasn't permanent. She'd been walking for 6 hours, not running. She was done running. Running implied she still believed there was somewhere worth reaching, and that particular illusion had burned out of her around the same time Davin Creel had stood in front of 30 witnesses and told her she was less than the mud on his boot, and the witnesses had nodded, because that was how the math worked in Ashford Pack. You were what the Alpha said you were. You were what the room agreed to. Kalina was nothing by consensus. She pulled her oilskin tighter across her shoulders and kept moving. The borderlands between Ashford Pack territory and the Northern Wolf Kingdom's outer reaches were called the Grey Waste by everyone who'd never had reason to enter them, and called something much worse by the people who'd survived the crossing. She'd heard 3 names in her 26 years. The Hunger Road, the Widow Mile, the place you walk through when all your other options have already been taken from you. She fit the demographic precisely. Her pack, former pack technically, though the mark Davin had made her bear for 3 years hadn't faded yet, still sat above her left collarbone like a brand she couldn't scrub off, was 2 days behind her. She'd left in the deep of night with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, her grandmother's silver pendant coiled at the bottom of a leather pouch, and enough dried food to last 4 days if she rationed it down to the bone. She always rationed. That was one of the things she'd learned young, before Davin, before the mate bond, before she understood that certain kinds of men read your restraint as evidence that you didn't need anything at all, that you were built to function on nothing, that taking from you wasn't a crime because you'd already proved you could survive it. The lightning came without the thunder, a flat white crack over the eastern tree line, and in the half-second of illumination she saw the shape of something ahead, a collapsed section of old wall, remnants of whatever watchtower had once marked this border before the kingdom stopped caring about the Grey Waste long enough to let it go feral. The stones were the color of charcoal and slick with rain, but the near corner of the wall still stood, and there was enough of an overhang to give her a dry patch to rest. She was about 15 feet from it when she smelled the blood. Not surface blood. Not a cut. Not a grazed palm. Not the kind of bleeding that announced itself and then sealed up. This was deep blood, organ blood, the kind that moved to the outside of a body, because the inside no longer had room for it. Her step slowed without her intending it to, some old reflex from years of moving carefully through spaces that rewarded caution. She stopped. She should keep walking. The calculus was simple, and she'd run it before, in different forms, with different variables, and it always came out the same. You were an Omega alone in the Grey Waste, in the middle of a 3-day storm. You had no allies, no weapons beyond the short knife she kept tucked against her right ankle, no authority to invoke if someone decided she was available. Stopping for a stranger in distress in a place like this was the kind of choice that got written up in the cautionary section of a story, not the survival section. Her feet stopped moving. She stood in the rain for a full 30 seconds, which was longer than she usually permitted herself to do anything that felt like hesitation. Then she moved toward the wall. He was on the ground on the sheltered side, positioned like he'd made it that far, and then simply stopped, which was probably exactly what had happened. He lay on his side, one arm folded beneath him, the other outstretched at an angle that looked wrong, and there was so much blood on his shirt that for a moment she thought she was looking at a dark pattern in the fabric rather than an actual wound. The rain had diluted it across the stone, running out in thin pink channels toward the lowest point of the ground. She crouched 3 feet away and didn't touch him. "Hey," she said. "Nothing. I need you to tell me whether you're alone." A sound. Not words. More like air moving through a passage that was partially obstructed. His chest was moving, but shallowly. Kalina looked around. Lightning again, longer this time, and she used it deliberately, scanning the perimeter of what she could see. No horses, no second set of tracks she could read in the mud before the rain destroyed them. No shapes at the tree line that read, as human. If he'd had escorts, they were either dead, fled, or far enough away to be irrelevant. She moved closer. He was large. She could read that even with him collapsed, the particular proportion of shoulder to torso that spoke to someone who'd been trained hard and long. His clothing was not the clothing of a traveler who'd underestimated the weather. Beneath the blood and the road dirt, there was quality there, a weight to the fabric, precision in the cut. Someone had spent money on this man. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. His pulse was present, but doing something she recognized as deeply bad. Fast and irregular, skipping beats the way a stone skips across water, which meant the body was compensating for something it hadn't figured out how to compensate for yet. She'd seen that pulse on 2 people in her life. One had survived. One hadn't. She found the wound by feel before she found it by sight. His shirt had been cut through, not torn, cut, and beneath it was a gash that started just below his right ribs and traveled inward and upward in a way that suggested whoever had made it had known exactly what they were aiming for. Not a fight wound, not the messy aftermath of a brawl. This was the work of someone with specific anatomical knowledge and enough composure to apply it under pressure. Her hands had gone still against his side. She was aware of them, aware of the warmth she could feel even through the cold of the rain, the particular heat that came from a body fighting to stay functional against circumstances that disagreed. "Listen," she said, not because she thought he could hear her, but because she'd found over the years that she thought better when she talked. "I'm going to make a decision here, and I want you to understand it's not because I think this is going to go well for me." She sat back on her heels and looked at her hands. The ability had come to her when she was 9 years old. She'd found a dog in the back field behind her grandmother's house, lying in the summer grass with a broken foreleg, and she'd put her hands on it because that was what you did when something was suffering in front of you. You put your hands on it and you stayed with it. The warmth had come up through her palms like water rising in a well. The dog had stopped whimpering within 30 seconds. The bone had taken 3 hours, and she'd passed out in the grass and woken up with her grandmother standing over her, wearing an expression Kaylina hadn't known how to read at the time and understood only later. That expression was fear. Not of Kaylina. For her. Her grandmother had sat her down in the kitchen with the kind of deliberateness that said this conversation had been waiting for years and had simply arrived earlier than expected, and she'd said, "Some gifts look like gifts until someone else decides what they're worth. Until then, keep it in your pocket like a knife you're not ready to use." Kaylina had kept it in her pocket for 17 years. She'd used it twice since the dog, both times in secret, both times on people who were dying and who she couldn't let die. A girl in the pack at 14, a fever that had broken wrong. An old man at 21 who'd collapsed in the market and whose heart had stopped briefly under her hands before she'd coaxed it back. Neither of them had known what she'd done. She'd been careful, she'd been invisible. She was about to be neither. She pressed both palms flat against the wound. The warmth came up immediately, which surprised her. She'd expected resistance, expected to have to work for it the way she'd worked for the old man's heart, but whatever was in her responded to this man's proximity, like a compass responding to north, not straining toward it but settling, as if this was a direction it had been trying to locate for some time. She ignored that. The sensation wasn't information she had time for. "Don't die," she said. It was not a request. It was the tone she'd learned in years of keeping herself alive in a pack that treated her survival as a personal inconvenience, the tone that did not leave room for negotiation. "I don't know who you are or what trouble you're carrying, but you don't get to die here and leave it for me to deal with. So work with me." His breathing changed. Not immediately. She worked for 40 minutes in the rain and the dark, crouched over a stranger whose name she didn't know, pressing her ability into the wound and watching it knit backward from the worst of it, the deepest point where the blade had gone farthest toward killing him. She could feel the damage like she could feel the grain of wood under a palm, texture and direction and where it was most fragile. She'd never worked something this extensive. It pulled at her in a way that was distinct from fatigue, more fundamental, like the sensation of blood leaving a body except the opposite. pouring outward from a source she'd never been sure she could trust. She stayed. She stayed when her knees went numb against the stone. She stayed when the rain found its way through the gap in the wall and soaked through to her shoulders. She stayed when her vision started doing the thing it did when she'd pushed too hard, the edges going soft and slightly wrong like a reflection in moving water. She stayed because she'd started, and she was not going to let him die 4 inches from the finish line. The bleeding stopped. The wound didn't close completely. That was beyond what she had left. But the deep damage was addressed, and when she checked his pulse again, it was slower and steadier. Still working hard, but no longer performing a controlled collapse. His breathing had evened out. The color had come back to the lower part of his face, the jaw, the throat, in a way she could see even in the intermittent lightning. He was going to live. Kaylina sat back on her heels and folded her arms across her chest, mostly because her hands were shaking and she preferred not to look at them shaking. She was very tired, the kind of tired that was 3 steps from the ground and she knew it. She let herself look at him properly. He was older than she'd initially thought, mid-30s at a guess, with dark hair that had been close cut at some point and had grown past the point of intention. His face was the kind that had been built for serious expressions, strong jaw, straight nose, a set to the brow even in unconsciousness that suggested this was a man who frowned as a default position and had been frowning long enough for it to become architectural. There were scars she could see, a thin line at his temple, something older along the left side of his jaw. Not decorative. Functional scars, the kind you got from situations rather than from choices. She noticed that he was handsome the way she noticed that the rain was cold, as a fact with no operational relevance. She checked the perimeter again, then moved to the driest corner of the overhang and sat with her back against the stone. She needed 20 minutes, not sleep. She wasn't stupid enough to sleep alone in the gray waste with an unknown man 6 feet away. But stillness, enough stillness to let her body recalibrate what she'd just spent. She pulled the leather pouch from inside her oilskin and turned it over in her fingers without opening it, felt the shape of her grandmother's pendant through the leather, the flat disc of silver with its stamped crescent, the chain worn thin where it had been handled. Her grandmother had died 3 years ago, 1 month before Davin had publicly rejected her, and Kaylina had considered in the worst of the weeks that followed that the timing had perhaps been a mercy, that she hadn't had to watch. She put the pouch back. She listened to the rain and to the man's breathing, which was slow and steady now, and she thought about the gray waste and where she was going and whether those 2 questions could be separated. Somewhere around the 3rd hour after she'd found him, his breathing shifted. The particular quality of unconscious breathing changed, sharpened at the edges, the kind of change that preceded awareness by a few minutes. Kaylina was already on her feet. She picked up her pack, shouldered it, checked that the knife was in position at her ankle without bending visibly, and stood at the edge of the overhang looking out at the rain. It was easing. Another hour and she could walk again. She should leave before he woke. She knew she should. A man she didn't know, injured in a way that read as targeted, in a place no one passed through without a reason. His story had weight to it, the kind of weight that landed on whoever was standing closest. She'd been standing closest to other people's dangerous stories for most of her life. She was done with that. She pulled the leather pouch out one more time, opened it, looked at the pendant. There was a part of her that wanted to leave something. She'd examined that impulse in herself before and had not come to a conclusion about it that satisfied her. Maybe it was just that she'd spent so much of her life being taken from without any record of what was lost, that the idea of leaving something of her own choosing, something she controlled the terms of, felt different, felt like authorship instead of transaction. She set the pendant on the stone beside him. Not the pouch, not the chain, just the silver disc, the crescent-stamped face turned upward. Her grandmother's mark, the only thing she'd kept. She regretted it approximately 2 seconds after she'd done it and decided the regret was a problem for a later version of herself. She walked out into the lessening rain. She made it 8 miles before sunrise, which was better than she'd expected given the state of her reserves. The land changed as she moved north and east, the scrub and wind-bent trees of the borderlands giving way to something older. Pine stands close enough together to break the wind, the ground beneath them carpeted in needles so deep they swallowed sound. She moved through it quietly because she always moved quietly, because the habit of silence was one you could not simply switch off once it had been ground into you year by year, like stone worn smooth by water. She stopped at midday in a clearing where a stream had cut itself a path through exposed rock, and she drank, and she ate sparingly, and she laid her oilskin flat to dry in the weak sunlight while she sat on a flat boulder and looked at the map she'd been carrying folded in her inside chest pocket since she'd stolen it from the pack records hall the night she left. She was not supposed to know about the exiled settlement. It wasn't a secret exactly. Secrets implied that someone was actively working to conceal something, and the truth about Valheld's Crossing was that nobody cared enough about it to conceal it. A settlement of wolves who'd left or been expelled from their packs, 60 miles north of the borderlands, sustained by trade with the outer villages and governed by no one's rules but their own. Her grandmother had mentioned it once, obliquely, in that way of hers that left the most significant things half said. She'd spent 2 days before leaving Ashford Pack memorizing the route off that stolen map. The route was achievable. 30 days if the weather held, 40 if it didn't, and she had enough to sustain herself through it if she found water reliably and supplemented the dried food with whatever she could gather or catch. She wasn't thinking about the man. She was categorically not thinking about the man she'd left unconscious against a wall in the gray waste with her grandmother's silver pendant sitting beside his head. She folded the map back and put it away. 3 days later, she walked into the first village large enough to have a well and a market, small enough to have neither guards nor curiosity about who she was. She traded an hour of work, scrubbing the back wall of the grain merchant's storehouse, for 2 nights in a dry loft and a meal. The work was hard. That was fine. Hard work was transactional in a way she trusted. She was spreading fresh straw across the loft floor when she heard voices below, the grain merchant and someone who'd come in from the road. She could tell by the mud on his voice that he'd been traveling, the kind of breathless that came from effort and urgency rather than exertion. Hit on the Grey Waste crossing, 3 nights back. 12 guard. King came through with 12 guard and someone got to them. The grain merchant said something in a low voice. Not dead. That's the word from the dispatch riders. Not dead, but close enough that they're not saying more than that. Kingdom's locked down border entry. They're looking for someone. Kaylina stopped moving. She stood in the loft with a handful of loose straw in each fist, and she stopped moving completely, and she did not breathe, and she ran the calculation very quickly and with the particular cold clarity that seemed to activate in her specifically in moments when the numbers were very bad. 3 nights back. Grey Waste crossing. 12 guards and someone had gotten to them. She'd found one man alone, with a targeted wound and quality fabric and a face built for serious expressions and the kind of scars you got from situations rather than choices. Not dead. The grain merchant said, "What does the king look like?" The traveler laughed, the sound of someone who thought the question was irrelevant. Like a king. Dark hair, big, looks like he'd be in a bad mood even when he wasn't half bled out. Why? Kalina set the straw down very carefully. She sat down on it very carefully. She pressed her back against the loft wall and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific sensation of the ground moving beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She'd pressed her hands into the wound. She'd spent 4 hours of her ability on him. She'd talked to him in the dark about dying and not being permitted to do it on her watch. She'd left him her grandmother's pendant. Her grandmother's pendant, with the crescent mark, with the particular stamp her grandmother had explained once, was an old bloodline mark, too specific and too old to be mistaken for anything else by anyone who knew what they were looking at. She'd left it sitting next to the face of King Ronan Ashgrave, ruler of the Northern Wolf Kingdom, and then she'd walked away. In 8 days, assuming he recovered at the pace she'd set him on, a king would wake up in the Grey Waste with a healer's mark sitting beside his head and 12 dead or scattered guards, and a story that was going to require an explanation. And the only explanation was her. Below her, the traveler said, "Word is he's putting riders out, kingdom-wide, wants to find whoever pulled him through. Reward substantial." "Gratitude?" said the grain merchant. "Could be." A pause. "Could be he wants to know who else knew he was taking that road." Kalina closed her eyes. She'd saved a king in secret and left her only identifier behind like a signed confession. And now the most powerful wolf in the northern kingdom was awake and alive and looking. She sat in that loft for a long time after the traveler left, not frozen. Kalina Voss did not freeze. Freezing was what happened to people who still believed that panic was a reasonable response to information, and she'd spent enough years in circumstances that made panic useless to have that particular reflex mostly burned out of her. What she did instead was go very still and very cold and run the numbers until the numbers gave her something she could work with. The numbers were not good. She'd left a silver pendant with a bloodline stamp next to the face of the Northern King. She'd used a gift nobody in the world except a dead woman knew she had. She'd done it in the Grey Waste, 3 days' walk from the nearest pack territory, which meant the only person who could have found him and the only person who could have pulled him back from that specific wound were the same person. There was no version of this where she was not already a thread someone was starting to pull. The question was not whether they would find her. The question was what she'd be when they did. She rose before dawn, gathered her pack, climbed down from the loft without making a sound, and was 2 miles down the road before the village's first fires were lit. She walked faster than she had before. Tasam. Ronan Ashgrave woke on the third day. He knew it was the third day because Edric told him, standing at the foot of the cot in the borderland post with the expression of a man who had spent 72 hours in the particular hell of waiting to find out if his king was going to require a funeral and who was now visibly recalibrating toward a different category of problem. 3 days, Ronan said. Yes. The men. Edric's jaw moved. 4 dead. The others will recover. Commander Vale took an arrow through the shoulder. He's mobile. Ronan sat up and his body informed him at length and in specific detail about the wound in his side. He processed this information and kept sitting up because the alternative was lying back down and he'd done enough of that. Assassination, he said. It was not a question. Coordinated. They knew the route, the timing, the gap in the escort rotation. Someone inside gave them the crossing schedule. Edric paused. Sire, you should know. When Vale reached you, you were not where we expected. You were 40 yards from the ambush site. You'd moved. I moved. And someone had treated the wound. Another pause, heavier. The bleeding had stopped. The internal damage, according to the physician who examined you, had been addressed in ways he cannot explain by the methods available in the Grey Waste. Ronan looked at his hands, at the dried matter he hadn't yet had reason to clean from the left one, and then at the stone floor, and then at the cot beside him, and at the things sitting on the edge of that cot, which he'd been aware of without looking at since the moment he woke. The silver pendant was small. Flat disc, thin chain, a crescent stamped into the face with the particular depth of a mark made for permanence rather than decoration. Old work. The chain was worn thin at 3 specific points, which meant someone had handled it repeatedly over a long period of time. Someone who kept it close and touched it in the way people touch things they were not ready to let go of. He picked it up. Tell me about whoever was with me, he said. Edric said, That's the problem. Wow. 3 weeks later, Ronan sat at the long table in the Eastern Strategy Room of Ashgrave Keep, with the pendant on the table in front of him and 12 people around him who had been combing the borderland territories since the morning after the ambush. The room smelled like tallow candles and damp wool, and the particular exhaustion of people who'd been thorough and come back empty. A woman, said Captain Dale, who had ridden 200 miles in the past 10 days and looked it. That's the consensus from the post and the 2 border villages we've traced. A woman traveling alone, northwest to southeast along the outer Grey Waste route. No pack name anyone's confirmed. No travel papers. The border post she passed through 3 days after the ambush recorded her as a single traveler headed for the outer settlements. Description. Medium height, brown hair. She did half a day's work in a grain merchant's storehouse in Travail in exchange for lodging. The merchant said she barely spoke. Moved like someone used to not taking up space. Ronan looked at the pendant. What bloodline mark is that? He said. The historian in the corner, an old man named Fossey, who had spent 40 years cataloging things the kingdom preferred not to think about, set down his cup. If I'm right, and I am, because I checked it 3 times, it's a Voss mark. Old house, pre-kingdom settlement, technically, The family that held the original Moonstone Sanctuary before the consolidation. The room went quiet in a particular way. There are no Voss descendants, said Edric, who believed in stating the obvious as a form of discipline. There is apparently one, said Fosse, traveling alone through the grey waste with a gift significant enough to address a wound that should have killed the king within 4 hours of its being made. Ronan picked up the pendant. He'd been doing that, he'd noticed, at intervals throughout the day. He'd stopped asking himself why. Find her, he said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without decoration, leaving no interpretive margin. Quietly. I want her located before the court knows she exists. Dael said, and when we find her? Ronan set the pendant back on the table. Bring her to me. Don't touch her. Don't frighten her more than you have to. He looked up. Tell whoever finds her that I intend to speak with her, not command her. Speak. Dael and Edric exchanged a look that Ronan chose not to acknowledge. Yes, sire, said Dael. Kalina did not make it to Valheld's crossing. She made it to within 20 miles of it, which was how close she was when the Ashford Pack outriders caught up with her. There were 4 of them. She heard the horses before she saw them, sound traveling through the pine stand differently in cold weather, and she had just enough time to process the direction they were coming from before they broke through the tree line on 3 sides, which told her this had been coordinated and that someone had known her approximate position before she'd realized she was being followed. Davin's man in front. She recognized Bosch before she recognized anyone else, because Bosch had a particular quality of stillness that was the opposite of calm. It was the stillness of someone actively choosing not to move yet, waiting for a better angle. She stopped walking. Kalina, said Bosch. She said nothing. You weren't easy to track. I wasn't trying to be tracked, she said. I was trying to be gone. Yeah. He tilted his head slightly, the way men did when they wanted you to know they were making a calculation about you. Alpha Creole wants you back. The cold in her chest was not fear. She'd spent enough time with fear to know its weight, and this was something different, something that had been fear once and had gone through some process and come out the other side harder. She looked at Bosch and at the 3 men positioned around her, and she thought very briefly about the knife at her ankle and discarded it, because the math on 4 trained wolves and a single blade was not the kind of math she could win in a pine forest with no clear line of exit. For what purpose? She said. Does it matter? It matters to me. Bosch almost smiled. You've gotten direct. I was always direct. You just didn't listen. She kept her eyes moving, tracking the 3 others without appearing to do so, an old habit, a survival habit. Tell me what he wants. Word got out about what you can do. Word travels. You know how it is. Someone who was in Tervelo saw you in that storehouse and connected it to some things people in Ashford should have connected a long time ago. Bosch shrugged with one shoulder. Alpha Creole made some inquiries. Turns out there are people willing to pay well for access to a healer with your particular range. He wants to sell me, she said. He wants to negotiate a contract, your presence, your cooperation. My cooperation. She heard her own voice from the outside, how flat it was, how little it gave him. I am 3 days out of his territory and 2 years out of his pack, and he does not have a legal claim on my body or my ability. The mate bond was dissolved. By him. Which means he dissolved it, which means the terms of dissolution are his to set. Bosch met her eyes. That's how it works, Kalina. You know that. She did know that. She'd known it when she left, had understood that the legal architecture of the mate bond in pack law was designed to make voluntary exit. Theoretical and actual exit nearly impossible. She'd left anyway, because the alternative was staying, and she'd spent enough time determining which category of impossible she could survive. I'm not going back, she said. That's... Bosch paused. Not really an option you have right now. The man to her left moved 2 steps closer, not aggressively, just precisely, in the way someone moved when they wanted you to be aware of geometry. Kalina felt the cold thing in her chest settle lower, denser. Not dread. The opposite of dread. The peculiar clarity that came when options collapsed down to 1, and the one remaining option was simply to take it without negotiation. If I go back, she said, he will contract me to whoever is paying him. I will spend the remainder of my functional years healing wounds for men who want an advantage in wars I have no stake in. That is what you're asking me to cooperate with. I'm asking you to not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder for who? Bosch looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his face that might have been the ghost of a scruple. Look, he said, lower. This isn't personal. You know that. I know it isn't personal for you, she said. For me, it's the only thing it can be. She threw the knife at the horse, not at the horse to hurt it. She angled for the saddle leather, the flat of the blade, the sound rather than the wound, and the horse did what horses did when something struck them unexpectedly and moved in the direction of least resistance, which was sideways into the man on its left. And in the 2 seconds of noise and rearrangement, she was already moving, not toward the gap, because there was no gap, but toward the densest section of the pine stand to the east, into terrain a person on foot could navigate faster than a person on horseback. She ran. She ran like she had not run since she was a child, running because she'd discovered that her feet could do something and she wanted to find out how far they could take her. Her lungs caught the cold air, and her heart made its position on this activity known, and she kept going, kept threading through the pines, using roots and the irregular surface of the ground the way water uses the path of least resistance, not fighting the terrain but going with it. Behind her she heard Bosch calling her name. Then she heard the horses, and she heard the distance between the horses and her closing, and she made a decision and cut left toward the sound of water she'd been half registering for the past minute, found the stream where the ground dropped away, went down the bank on her heels and across through water that hit her boots and the bottom of her leggings with cold that registered as a number rather than a sensation, up the far bank into the tree line on the other side. The horses stopped at the stream. She kept running for another 20 minutes before she allowed herself to slow. She walked for an hour. She checked her back trail twice and found nothing following. Then she stopped in a stand of old pine, put her back against the largest trunk, and bent forward with her hands on her knees and let her body have the reaction she'd been withholding from it. Her hands were shaking. That was fine. Her hands had been shaking since she'd pressed them against a king's wound, and she'd been managing that all right. 4 outriders. Davin had sent 4 outriders for her, which meant Davin had been looking for her actively, not waiting for her to surface, but actively tracking her, which meant the thing Bosch had said was true. Someone had seen her in Tervele and talked, and whatever she'd done in Tervele had gotten back to Ashford before the week was out. She pressed the back of one shaking hand to her mouth and made herself breathe through it. She could not go north now. Valheld's crossing was 20 miles away, but Bosch knew the direction she'd been traveling, and a settlement of 60 mixed-pack wolves was not a place you could hide anyone who a sitting alpha was actively searching for. They'd give her up without hesitation, not out of malice, out of self-preservation, which was the same math she herself ran every time she made a choice, and she couldn't fault them for it. She needed to disappear in a different direction. She pulled out the map. East was kingdom territory, which had been a risk before and was now a complication of a specific and significant kind, because there was a king in that territory who was also looking for her, who had her grandmother's pendant and a description of a woman who moved like someone used to not taking up space, and who had 12 riders out on kingdom-wide search. She stood in the dark between 2 sets of people looking for her in opposite directions, and she thought about what her grandmother had said. Some gifts look like gifts until someone else decides what they're worth. Her grandmother had not been wrong. She also thought about what she had not said, which was the other half of the sentence, the half that only became visible in retrospect. And then you have to decide what it's worth to you. Kaylina folded the map back. She looked east at the dark spaces between the trees where the kingdom began, at the direction she'd sworn she was not going. She thought about Bosch and 4 outriders, and Davin's particular talent for making everything she tried to keep hers into leverage he could use. She thought about a man with a targeted wound and 12 dead guards, and the kind of face that frowned as a default position. She thought about the pendant she'd set down beside him, the only thing her grandmother had ever given her that she'd managed to keep, now sitting in a strategy room 300 miles away on a table where men were deciding what to do with the information it represented. The sound of horses reached her again from the northwest. Bosch had doubled back. He was systematic. She should have expected that. Kaylina went east, not because she trusted the kingdom, not because she trusted the king, Because between the man who knew exactly what she was worth and intended to sell it, and the man who knew approximately what she was worth and had told his riders to speak rather than command, the math was not ambiguous. She went east, into King's territory, into the worst idea she'd had in a year of bad ideas, and she did not let herself think about what was waiting at the other end of the decision. She would think about that when she got there. Behind her, somewhere in the pines, Bosch called her name a final time. The sound of it moved through the dark and found no purchase. She was already gone. And somewhere to the east, in a keep she'd never seen, a king turned her grandmother's pendant over in his hand and told his captain to ride harder. He had no way of knowing she was already coming toward him, and she had no way of knowing that Davin Creel, the man who'd dissolved their bond and then spent 2 years deciding she was still his to sell, had already sent a very different kind of message east. Not to the king, to the men who had tried to kill him. She crossed into kingdom territory on a Tuesday, which meant nothing except that it gave her a day of the week to attach to the decision, and attaching specifics to decisions was something she'd learned to do when the decisions were irreversible. It made them feel like history instead of mistakes. The first kingdom checkpoint waved her through. She had no papers and told them so, gave them a name that was not her name, and stated her destination as Carvalho, which was a trade settlement far enough east to be plausible and far enough from her actual direction to buy her time. The guard at the checkpoint was 19 years old and cold and wanted to go back inside. He waved her through. She did not go to Kervale. She went north along the kingdom's western road, moving parallel to the border she'd just crossed, keeping the tree line to her left and the road's edge to her right, and her pace fast enough to cover ground without being the kind of fast that attracted attention. The settlements here were kingdom-governed, which meant different rules. Pack hierarchy still existed, but it existed inside a larger structure, and the largest wolf in any given room was not automatically the one who set the terms. That was a distinction that mattered to her. She needed to stop moving. She needed a place with enough population density to make her anonymous and enough commerce to make her useful, because useful was the safest thing a woman with no pack name and no papers and a gift she couldn't advertise could be in a territory that didn't know her. She found it in a town called Dresd, 12 miles inside the kingdom border, large enough to have 2 inns and a weekly market, and a healer's post that had been understaffed for 3 months since the previous resident had retired to the outer settlements. She found this out from the woman who ran the larger inn, who told her inside of 4 minutes of conversation, because 4 minutes was all it took Kylina to identify the right question to ask and ask it directly. "You have any experience?" said the innkeeper. "Enough," said Kylina. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have that I can verify. You could let me demonstrate or you could send me down the road. Your post's been empty 3 months, which means people in this town have been traveling to Kervale for anything serious. That costs them time and money, and some of them aren't making the trip when they should." She held the innkeeper's eyes. "Let me work a week. At the end of the week, decide." The innkeeper looked at her for a long moment with the assessing quality of someone who'd run a business long enough to know that the most useful people frequently arrived with the least documentation. "Week," she said. "Don't steal anything." "I don't steal," Kylina said. She was in the healer's post by nightfall. Knit. The work was ordinary, and she let it be ordinary, which was its own discipline. Cuts, fevers, a broken finger she set and splinted while the farmer who owned it sat very still and breathed loudly through his nose. A child with an infected ear that she treated with compresses, and instruction for the mother without reaching for anything deeper, because the ordinary methods were sufficient, and the extraordinary ones were for when they weren't. And that line, the line between what could be handled with skill and what required something else, was the most important line she maintained. She did not use the gift. She was careful not to use the gift. She was 17 days into Dresd and had started to believe carefully and with significant reservations that she might have found a place to exist for a while when the riders came. Not Bosch, not Davin's men. These were kingdom riders, and she knew them for what they were before they dismounted, because kingdom riders had a particular quality to how they moved, organized, measured, aware of their own authority without needing to perform it. 2 of them. They came to the healer's post directly, which meant they'd asked in town, which meant her cover in Dresd was now at most a few hours old. She was at the workbench when they came in. She did not stand up. Kalina Voss, said the one who spoke first. It was not a question, which told her they already knew, which meant this was not a search anymore. Who's asking? She said. Captain Dale. Northern Kingdom Royal Guard. He set something on the workbench in front of her. She looked at it for a moment before she let herself recognize it. Her grandmother's pendant. The king requests your presence, said Dael. The king can request whatever he wants, she said. The flatness in her voice surprised her. It was very complete. What I want to know is whether request means request or whether it means something else. Dael looked at her steadily. He was a man who'd given difficult messages to people who didn't want to receive them enough times that he'd developed a neutral expression for it that was not unkind. He said to tell you, speak, not command. She looked at the pendant. She thought about Davin and 4 outriders and the message that had apparently already gone east from him. The message she didn't know the content of, but whose existence Bosch had all but confirmed with the particular satisfaction he'd let show when he'd said that Davin had made inquiries. You didn't make inquiries into the kingdom without making contact, between a former mate who'd sold her and a king who'd sent her pendant back. All right, she said. She stood up. Maz. Ashgrave Keep was 3 days' ride, and Dale made no attempt to prevent her from observing the route, which she filed as information. Either they were confident enough in her cooperation not to worry about it, or the king had told him to extend that courtesy deliberately. She wasn't sure which reading was more unsettling. She was taken to a receiving room rather than a throne room, which was also information. Smaller. A table, chairs, a fire, the functional plainness of a room used for work rather than performance. The pendant had been returned to the leather pouch and placed in her hand before she entered. Ronan Ashgrave was standing at the window when she came in. She had a moment before he turned, a moment in which she looked at him upright and functional and breathing with both lungs, and felt something she would not have been able to name precisely, something between relief and a peculiar resentment that he got to be alive and she got to be the one who'd complicated her life ensuring it. He turned. She'd been right about the face. Built for serious expressions, the frown was not currently active, but its architecture was visible, the structure that supported it. He was taller than she'd registered in the dark, which had been very dark, and he looked at her with an assessment that was not aggressive but was thorough, the way someone looked at a map before they decided on a route. Sit down, he said. I'll stand. A pause. Something crossed his face that might have been surprise reconfiguring into something else. All right, he said. He sat. She remained standing, and neither of them commented on this arrangement. You saved my life, he said. Yes. You left before I woke. Yes. Why? She looked at him directly. Because the only thing worse than finding a dying stranger in the gray waste is finding out what kind of trouble he brought with him before you've had time to put distance between yourself and it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The shape of one, showing itself briefly and then retreating. You knew who I was. I didn't. I found out 3 days later in a grain merchant's storehouse. She paused. At which point, the distance strategy was already failing. You left your pendant. She said nothing. He reached into his coat and set the leather pouch on the table between them. She looked at it. She did not touch it. It's yours, he said. You used it to find me. I used the mark to identify your bloodline. Yes. He watched her. Fossey says the Voss line has been considered extinct for 40 years. He was very agitated about being wrong. My grandmother was careful. About more than one thing, apparently. He leaned forward slightly, not a threatening lean, more the posture of someone who was accustomed to chairs being too small for the quality of attention they paid to things. I want to know about the healing. No. The word fell cleanly. She watched him receive it. That's not a negotiation opening, she said. I'm not being coy. You don't get that information. What I can do with my hands is mine, and the list of people who know about it is short, and every single person who's tried to extend that list has done so because they wanted to use it for something I don't consent to. He was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, she could hear the fire and the faint sounds of the keep around them. The people who tried to kill me, he said. Do you know who they were? No. We've traced the coordination to 3 sources. 2 are external. 1, he stopped, is internal. She watched his face during the stop. In the stop was where the information lived. Who? She said. My senior intelligence advisor. A man named Corvin. He's been in this court for 11 years. His jaw moved. I gave him the crossing schedule myself. The fire crackled. The keep sounds continued around them, indifferent. You trusted him, she said. I did. Flat. 2 words pressed close together, no room for air between them. I was wrong. She understood then, looking at him, that this was not a king making a disclosure in a negotiation. This was a man sitting with the particular weight of having been wrong about something fundamental, not strategically wrong, not tactically wrong, but wrong in the part of himself that made judgments about people. She recognized the weight because she'd carried a version of it for 3 years, and she knew that there was no way to put it down that didn't change the shape of your hands afterward. They haven't found him, she said. Not a question. He disappeared 2 days after the ambush. His eyes came back to hers. Along with every record he kept that might have told us who else was involved. She picked up the leather pouch, turned it over once. The weight of the pendant inside was exactly as she remembered. What do you want from me? She said. Right now, nothing. I wanted to see you. I wanted to... He stopped again, differently. Thank you for what you did, for a reason that had nothing to do with who I was. She looked at him. I didn't know who you were, she said. I might have made a different calculation if I had. I know. Something in his face settled. That's part of what I wanted to thank you for. She was given rooms. Not a cell, not a guarded chamber, rooms with a window that faced east and a door she could lock from the inside. She tested the lock. She was not surprised that it worked. She was somewhat surprised by how much that mattered to her. She'd been in the keep 4 days when the plague began. It announced itself the way catastrophes usually did. Not all at once, but in accumulation, cases scattered across the western settlements that looked like fever, until they didn't. Until the fever became something else. Something that moved through pack bonds like fire, through dry timber. She heard it first from the keep's physician, who'd been receiving field reports with the expression of a man watching water rise. It's moving fast, he said. He was talking to his assistant, but she was in the room, treating a guard's hand injury, and she listened without appearing to. Pack-bonded wolves are transmitting it through the connection itself. Singles are slower to present, but they present. By the 6th day, the keep's receiving hall had been repurposed as a triage space. By the 8th, 2 members of the court staff were dead. She had not seen Ronan in 4 days. She understood he was managing the crisis through every channel the kingdom had. She understood from the controlled urgency in the keep's corridors that none of those channels were working. On the 9th day, Edric found her in the physician's wing where she'd been working alongside the medical staff doing everything that did not require her to be more than she was presenting herself as. He wants to speak with you, said Edric. She went. Ronan was in the strategy room. He was not alone. 3 advisors, maps, field reports spread across the table in layers. He looked up when she came in and told the others to go, which they did with the particular efficiency of people accustomed to being told to go. She looked at the maps, the marks on them, red for confirmed cases, the spread pattern they made. It's accelerating, she said. Yes. He came around the table. He was close enough that she could read the damage the past 9 days had put on his face, the specific way sustained crisis hollowed a person around the eyes, the jaw, the places where the body tried to hold itself together under ongoing pressure. I need to know about the healing. I told you. I need to know because the physician has found something. He picked up a report from the table and handed it to her. 3 weeks ago, he'd never have thought to look for it, but you were in his wing for 4 days and apparently you're not as invisible as you think you are. She read the report. She read it twice. He thinks the origin is the Moonstone Sanctuary, she said. What's left of it? The ruins in the Keld Valley. He watched her. He thinks someone introduced something into the old site's remaining channels. Something that's using the pack bonds as a pathway. Something that looks old. A pause. Old in a specific way. She set the report down. The Moonstone Sanctuary. Her grandmother's stories about it had always had the quality of things that were both history and warning. The old bloodline site, the place where the Voss family had maintained certain channels for keeping the territory's pack bonds stable, the thing that had been abandoned and sealed and supposedly neutralized when the kingdom consolidated a century ago. Supposedly. Someone opened it, she said. We think someone's been using it, slowly, over time. And now whatever they started has moved beyond what they can control, or they've let it go deliberately. He held her eyes. Corvin had access to the historical records, including the ones about the sanctuary. The name landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Corvin. The man who'd given her king to the assassins. The man who'd disappeared with 11 years of knowledge about the kingdom's internal architecture. Who'd apparently had enough time and access to do something with very old channels in a ruined place that only one bloodline in the world retained any native connection to. You need someone who can address the source, she said. Yes. You need someone the sanctuary will recognize. Yes. You're asking me to go there. He didn't look away. I'm asking if you'll go. There's a difference. She stood in the strategy room with the map in front of her showing red marks spreading across the kingdom's wolf population like ink dropped in water, spreading through the bonds that connected pack to pack, moving through the architecture of trust itself, because trust was the pathway it traveled. And she thought about her grandmother, about sealed things that could be unsealed, about the particular category of problem that had someone else's fingerprints all over its design. She thought about Corvin, who had betrayed a king, who had 11 years of knowledge about this kingdom, who had left, who might not have left alone. I'll need to know everything, she said. Not what you think is relevant. Everything. He nodded. Then we need to leave soon, she said. If this is what I think it is, every day we wait. I know. She looked at the map one more time, at the spread of it, the pattern, the particular direction of the worst clusters. Ronan. She said his name for the first time, without a title, without planning to. He went still slightly, not visibly, but she felt it the way you felt someone catch a breath. The people who tried to kill you and the thing happening in that sanctuary, I don't think those are two separate problems. The silence lasted 3 seconds. No, he said. His voice was very quiet. Neither do I. She picked up the field report. She turned it over in her hands and looked at the dates, the progression, the careful, patient timeline of it. Someone had been preparing this for a long time. Someone who understood the old bloodline architecture well enough to use it, who understood the pack bonds well enough to corrupt them, who had positioned himself inside the most trusted room in the kingdom for 11 years. And somewhere in the ruined Moonstone Sanctuary, at the source of a plague that was killing the people of a kingdom she had no reason to care about and could not seem to stop herself from caring about, the preparation was complete. Whatever had been started, there was not waiting anymore. And the only person with the blood to stop it was standing in a strategy room trying to decide how much of herself she was willing to spend on a world that had never once spent anything on her. Her grandmother's voice, from somewhere very far back. Some gifts look like gifts until someone else decides what they're worth. And then the other half, the half that only became visible when you had no other options left. And then you have to decide what it's worth to you. She folded the report. Tell me about the sanctuary, she said. Tell me everything you know. Outside the keep walls, somewhere in the western settlements, another wolf went down with fever in the night. Another bond flickered and dimmed through the channels that were supposed to carry trust between pack and pack. And deep in the Keld Valley, in the ruins of a place that had been sealed for a century by a family that was supposed to be extinct, something old and patient and very deliberately aimed continued its work. It had been waiting a long time. It would not need to wait much longer. They rode out before dawn with 12 guards and no announcement. Ronan had wanted 20 guards. Kalina had said 10 was too many. They'd landed on 12 the way people who were not yet accustomed to negotiating with each other landed on things, through the particular friction of two people who both had reasons and neither had the energy to pretend otherwise. The sanctuary will read presence, she'd told him the night before, standing over the maps with the field report spread between them like an accusation. Old sites like that, they're not passive. They have a sensitivity to mass approach. If we come in force, whatever Corvin built there responds before we're close enough to do anything about it. And if we come in light, and there are men waiting, then we deal with men. She'd looked up at him. I'd rather deal with men than with a triggered defense built from corrupted bloodline channels. Men, I understand. He'd looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd started to recognize, not agreement exactly, more the quality of someone updating an internal model in real time, revising an estimate upward. 12, he'd said. Fine. They rode hard. The Keld Valley was 2 days southeast, and every hour they spent on the road was an hour the plague spent in the western settlements, moving through pack bonds the way fire moved through connected rooms, contained by nothing, slowed by nothing, finding every opening the architecture provided. She rode beside him rather than behind him, which had not been explicitly arranged but had happened anyway, and neither of them commented on it. On the first night they made camp in a hollow sheltered by old stone outcroppings, and the guard set a perimeter and built a fire that was small and deliberate, and she sat with her back against a rock and looked at the map by firelight and felt him sit down 3 feet from her without looking up. Tell me what to expect, he said. I don't know precisely. She kept her eyes on the map. My grandmother described the sanctuary as a place built for amplification. The Voss bloodline has a native resonance with the channels there, like a key to a lock that nobody else can fit. She paused. If Corvin found a way to corrupt the channels rather than close them, he's essentially turned the amplification against itself. What was built to stabilize pack bonds is now destabilizing them. Can you reverse it? I think so. She folded the map. I don't know what it costs. He was quiet. The fire made its small sounds. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. Davin Creel sent a message to Corvin. We found the cipher in the records Corvin didn't manage to take when he ran. His voice was even, that particular evenness of someone who was being careful about their own anger. He sold your location. The Grey Waste route you took, Creel's outriders tracked you and passed the information east, to Corvin, who passed it to someone else. She absorbed this. Someone else, she said. We don't have the full chain, but the message referenced your bloodline by name. Whoever Corvin's working with knew what you were before I did. She looked at the fire, thought about Bosch in the pines saying that Davin had made inquiries, about the particular satisfaction in his voice. She'd read it as leverage, Davin positioning himself to sell her ability to the highest bidder. She hadn't read it as something that connected backward to an assassination attempt and forward to a corrupted sanctuary. She should have. The failure irritated her. They wanted me in the kingdom, she said. I think they wanted you accessible, whether that meant in the kingdom or removed from the equation entirely depended on what they needed. He looked at her. I think the plan changed when I survived. She understood then. If Ronan had died on the Grey Waste, the kingdom would have gone to his cousin, a younger man she'd heard described twice in the keep as manageable. The assassination and the plague were not parallel attacks. They were sequential. The plague was the contingency, the option you exercised when the cleaner solution failed. Someone had been building this for a long time, patient and systemic and working from inside the walls. Corvin, she said, how long have you known him? 11 years. His jaw set. He was recommended by my father's counsel. I trusted the recommendation. She thought about what it meant to trust a recommendation, to extend your faith through another person's judgment and have it connect to something that had been waiting 11 years to close its hand around you. The particular horror of that was not in the betrayal itself, but in the timeline. The understanding that the thing that hurt you had been growing in your house since before you knew you'd need to protect yourself from it. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. She thought he might say something dismissive. She'd half expected it, the reflex of a man who'd learned to manage information about his own wounds by moving past them quickly. Instead, he said, "Thank you." They didn't speak again for a while, and the fire burned down, and somewhere beyond the stone outcropping one of the guards made a round and the footsteps were steady and even, and then they weren't. She was on her feet before she'd consciously processed the change in sound. Ronan was up beside her. The guard who came through the perimeter gap was walking wrong. Too stiff. The particular gait of someone managing something that had hit them and that they were not yet ready to acknowledge had hit them. He made it 8 feet into the camp and then sat down abruptly on the ground. "Contact," he said. His voice was remarkably level. "West side. 4. At least 4, possibly." The first arrow came out of the dark and hit the stone 3 inches from Kalina's head. Everything moved at once. They fought in the dark and the firelight and the particular chaos of an ambush that had been set by people who knew what they were doing. Kalina stayed low and moved and used the stone outcroppings the way she'd used the pine stand, not as cover exactly, but as geometry, as a way of making the angles work against whoever was trying to find her. There were 6 of them. Not 12, not 20, 6, which said something about whoever had sent them. Either they were very confident in 6, or 6 was what could be spared, or the goal wasn't to kill everyone, but to accomplish something specific with the disruption. She found out what specific meant when she registered that 3 of the 6 were moving toward her and not toward Ronan. They knew who she was. They knew what she was. She went flat behind a low stone as something whistled over her, then came up and ran for the far side of the camp where the horses were tied. Not because she wanted the horse, but because the man following her closest was between her and the rest of the camp, and she needed him to commit to a direction before she committed to hers. He committed. She stopped, turned, and hit him with the rock she'd picked up without entirely planning to, the flat side against the side of his head, and he went down with the boneless quality of someone whose body had received information it couldn't argue with. She looked at him on the ground and felt nothing particularly complicated. She'd stopped expecting herself to feel complicated things about men who were trying to take her against her will. The fight was over in 6 minutes. She knew because she counted, the way she'd learned to count time in moments where everything was happening too fast for narrative and what you needed was just the increments. 2 of the 6 were dead. 3 were restrained. 1 had run. She walked back into the firelight and found Ronan standing with blood on his left hand and the expression of a man doing a rapid audit of everyone in his immediate vicinity. His eyes found her, and something in his posture changed. Not much, a fraction of a degree in the shoulder, but she saw it. "You're hurt," she said. "Grazed." He looked at the hand. "It's not. Let me see it." He let her see it. She examined the cut, determined it was what he'd said it was, and taped it closed from the kit the physician had sent with them. His hand was steady under hers. She worked quickly and without commentary. When she was done, he didn't move his hand immediately. She let that pass without remark. The one who'd run, Adric found him 2 miles down the road before morning, which suggested he hadn't been running so much as retreating to a position. And when they searched him, they found a cipher note that matched the fragments from Corvin's records. They were expected at the sanctuary. The Keld Valley announced itself the next afternoon as a change in the air before it announced itself as landscape. A heaviness, a particular quality of pressure that she associated with places where old working had been done and had not fully dissipated. Her grandmother had described it. She hadn't expected to feel it so clearly, hadn't expected her own blood to register it as distinctly as a sound heard in a quiet room. She said nothing to Ronan about what she was feeling. She didn't have words for it that wouldn't sound unstable, and she needed him to trust her judgment for what was coming. The ruins came into view at dusk. Stone columns, a collapsed central hall, the skeletal geometry of a structure that had been built to last, and had lasted past the civilization that built it into something that was now mostly absence and old intention. The channels her grandmother had described were not visible, but they were present. She could feel them the way you felt the current in water that looked still on the surface. And threading through the current, wrong, deliberately wrong, like a voice speaking in a known language and saying things the language was not built for. The corruption. "He's here," she said. Ronan's hand moved to his weapon. "Corvin, someone is." She studied the ruins. "The corruption is active. Someone's maintaining it." They left the guards at the valley entrance with orders that were clear and contingent and went in with 2. Kalina led because she was the one who could feel the channels, and because Ronan did not argue about it, which she took as evidence that he'd made a decision somewhere in the past 2 days about what this situation required and what his role in it was. They found Corvin in the central hall. He was standing at what had been the sanctuary's primary channel node. She could feel that too, the concentration of it, the place where the old bloodline work had been focused, and through which the corruption was now running like a river that had been rerouted through a wound. He was a slight man, older than she'd imagined, with the look of someone who'd spent decades being underestimated and had developed an entire interior life around that underestimation. He looked at her when she came in. "The last Voss," he said, not surprised, as though he'd been waiting. "The man who's been using a Voss site for 11 years, she said. He almost smiled. "Longer than that, but 11 years in position to make it matter." "Who are you working for?" "Working with," he corrected. "There's a distinction. I'm not a servant." He glanced at Ronan. "Unlike most of the people in that keep." Ronan said, "Corvin." One word. The weight of 11 years in it, the specific gravity of a man who'd discovered the dimensions of how wrong he'd been and had not yet found the limit of it. Corvin looked at him without flinching. "You were never going to be what the kingdom needed. You know that. You've known it for years. Too rigid, too slow to understand that the pack hierarchy was a dead structure, that what was required was something older." He gestured at the ruins around him. "Something with actual roots." "And the plague," said Ronan. "The people dying in the western settlements, are they part of what the kingdom needs?" "Costs," said Corvin simply. The word fell into the silence of the hall, and nothing mitigated it. She felt the channel's pulse, felt the corruption move through them with the rhythm of something that was being actively directed. Corvin's hand on it, his working, the product of whatever knowledge he'd assembled over decades of patient preparation. She felt, below that, her own blood's response to the sight. The resonance her grandmother had described, not activated yet, present, waiting to see what she decided. She made the decision. "Get away from the node," she said to Corvin. He looked at her. "Or what?" "Or I work around you, which is messier for you." Something shifted in his face. He'd underestimated her too, she realized. He'd factored in the Voss bloodline as a tool he needed to neutralize, not as a person who'd been navigating people who underestimated her for her entire functional life and had developed a comprehensive approach to it. He moved. Not away from the node, toward her, and toward the guard to her left simultaneously, and what followed was fast and close and brutal in the way that fights in small spaces always were, without the distance that made action legible, just bodies and impact and the instinctive grammar of physical confrontation. Ronan hit him from the right. She moved for the node. She pressed her hands to the stone of the channel node and felt it come up through her palms the way it had come up in the gray waste, that immediate settling quality, like a compass finding north. But this was not a wound. This was a corruption threaded through a structure, layered and deliberate, and in some places so densely worked that she could feel where Corvin had spent years on a single channel, patient and precise. She pushed. The cost was immediate. Not pain exactly, more the sensation of being rapidly emptied, of something that lived in her at a level below conscious access flowing outward into the structure faster than she'd intended. She held on. She found the center of the corruption, the place where it had been seated first, and she put everything she had against it. The hall went white. She was aware, distantly, of sound. Corvin's voice, then Ronan's, then a sound that was not either of them, but the channels themselves, the old structure responding to something it hadn't felt in decades, something that matched its original frequency. She was aware of the floor coming up. She was aware of a hand catching her arm before the floor completed its arrival. She was aware that the warmth she'd always associated with the ability flowing outward had reversed, was pulling inward, was taking more than she'd offered. "Kalina," Ronan's voice. Close. She tried to respond and found the distance between intention and execution had gotten very large. "Kalina, look at me." She looked at him. His face was very close, and the expression on it was not the frowning default architecture she'd catalogued. It was something else entirely, something she didn't have the spare capacity to name. "Tell me what to do," he said. The corruption was not gone. She'd reached the center, she'd damaged it, she'd felt it fracture in the way old working fractured under direct bloodline pressure. But fractured was not destroyed, and the channels were still moving, still carrying what Corvin had put in them, and she did not have enough left to finish it. She could feel that with complete clarity. She did not have enough left. "I can't," she started. "Tell me what to do," he said again. The same words, the same weight, but something underneath them that hadn't been there the first time. Not a command, something a king did not have a practiced voice for, something he was doing without a template. She looked at him. She looked at his hand on her arm, the taped cut on his palm, the blood that had soaked through the tape in the fight. She said, "Give me your hand." He didn't ask why. He gave her his hand. She pressed it flat against the channel node beside hers, and she put her blood's resonance against the corruption one more time. And this time she was not working alone. This time there was something beside her in the channel. Not bloodline, Ronan carried none, but presence. The specific and substantial presence of a person who had decided they were not leaving, and sometimes that was its own kind of working. The corruption fractured further. The channels began to clear. And somewhere in the Keld Valley, in the stone ruins of a place that had not functioned in a century, something old and patient came back online in the direction it had been built for. But Kaylina's vision was going dark at the edges, spreading inward, and the last thing she was clearly aware of was Ronan saying her name again. Not a command, not a request, something underneath both of those that she would have to think about later, when she was conscious, when there was a later. The channels sang, the corruption screamed, and the darkness finished what it had started. She woke to stone ceiling and the smell of wood smoke and the specific quality of silence that meant someone was working very hard to be quiet nearby. She lay still for a moment and took inventory. Her hands were the first thing. She looked at them without lifting them, the way you checked something you were afraid to move until you knew what it would cost. They looked the same, older, maybe. She'd heard her grandmother say once that using the gift aged the hands faster than other work, and she'd thought at the time that it was a strange thing to focus on. She understood it better now. The ceiling was stone, but not rough stone. Fitted, mortared, the inside of a structure. Not the ruins. She'd been moved. "You've been out for 2 days." Ronan's voice came from her left, and she turned her head and found him sitting in a chair that looked like it had been pulled from somewhere more formal and placed in this room without much attention to comfort. He looked like a man who had been sitting in an uncomfortable chair for a significant portion of 2 days and had decided this was acceptable. "The corruption," she said. Her voice came out rough. "Cleared, fully, as far as the physician can determine." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her with the focused quality she'd come to recognize as his version of close attention. "The plague cases in the Western settlements are recovering. The bond disruption stopped approximately 6 hours after the sanctuary." She absorbed this. "Corvin," she said, "in custody." A pause. "He didn't resist after you went down. I think he understood that whatever working he'd built was finished, and that fighting 4 guards with nothing behind him was a different kind of mathematics than fighting them with a corrupted sanctuary running at his back." She sat up slowly. Her body had opinions about this, but expressed them quietly, a deep fatigue that was different from illness, more like the aftermath of having been turned inside out, and then right side in again, every system having to relearn its own location. "Who was he working with?" she said. "We have 3 names so far. 2 are pack alphas from the southern territories who believed a destabilized northern kingdom would improve their position. 1 is a member of my own court, a woman named Sarath, who sat on my trade council for 6 years. He said the last name with the same flat evenness he used for everything that cost him something he hadn't finished calculating yet. She's in custody. The others are being addressed." "How many people knew about me?" "The full Voss bloodline connection, Corvin, and whoever he told." He held her eyes. "He'd been tracking your grandmother for years. The extinction of the Voss line was apparently information he'd had reason to question." She thought about her grandmother, about the careful life she'd built around the question of not being found, the dog in the back field, the kitchen conversation, the pendant. She'd built an entire architecture of invisibility, and it had been seen through by a patient man with enough time and enough access to read old records. and she was gone before anyone thought to warn her granddaughter. She knew someone was looking, Kaylina said. Not to Ronan exactly. To the room, to the space where conclusions arrived after a long transit. Probably, he said quietly. She didn't tell me. Would it have helped? She thought about that honestly. No. I was 23 when she died. I would have been more afraid without being better equipped to do anything about it. She looked at her hands. She gave me the pendant instead. Told me about the bloodline mark. Let me carry a piece of the identity without the target it would have put on my back. She protected you the best way she knew. Yes. The word was simple and heavy. She did. The room held that for a moment. Outside the single window, the light was afternoon light, low and pale, the particular quality of northern autumn light that looked like it was apologizing for something. She reached up and touched the leather pouch at her neck. Someone had put it back there while she was unconscious, which was a choice someone had made that she would think about at a later time. But Corvin's trial took 3 weeks. The kingdom's legal structure for treason was elaborate and slow, designed in an era when the primary threat had been external rather than internal. And watching it process a man who had sat inside it for 11 years building the means of its undoing had the quality of a machine attempting to eat something it had not been built to digest. It managed. It took 3 weeks, but it managed. Kaylina attended the final day of proceedings because Ronan asked her to, and because she'd decided sometime in the past 2 weeks that when he asked her things rather than telling her things, she was willing to consider the asks on their merits. Corvin saw her across the hall when they brought him in for sentencing. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the sanctuary, assessing, categorizing, placing her in the correct position in the architecture of his understanding. She looked back at him without expression. She'd spent years being looked at by people who were calculating what she was worth to them. She had a very complete face for it. He looked away first. The sentence was exile, which surprised her. She'd expected something more absolute. And she said so afterward, walking back through the keep's corridors with Ronan in the particular way they'd developed over the past 3 weeks of moving through the same spaces, where the distance between them was smaller than it had been, and neither of them had formalized why. Execution makes him an event, Ronan said, something that can be mythologized. Exile makes him a man who lost. He glanced at her. I want people who come after him to understand what's available to them if they try something similar. A man who lost is a more useful lesson than a martyr. She considered this. That's colder than I expected. Yes, he said it without apology. Governance is often cold. The warmth goes into the outcome, not the method. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, turned it over in the particular way she turned things over when they'd connected to something in her own experience, and she hadn't finished determining what. She'd spent years watching Davin operate. The hot anger, the performances of power, the cruelty that was mostly about how it looked. This was something different, something that thought further ahead than the immediate satisfaction. She wasn't sure she fully trusted it, but she understood it, which was different from trust and was sometimes more durable. Davin Creel came to the keep the 4th week. She found out he was in the outer reception hall because Edric told her, with the expression of a man who had been instructed to tell her and was conveying the instruction along with his own assessment of it, which was skeptical. The king will see him whenever you're ready, Edric said. Or not, as you determine. She looked at him. That's not how judicial proceedings work. The king has determined that in this specific matter, it is. A pause. Sire's words were, she has standing in any proceeding that concerns her. My words are that if you need 5 minutes before you go in, 5 minutes is available. She didn't need 5 minutes. She'd spent 3 years processing Davin Creel, and she'd come to the end of that particular interior work some time ago. What was left was not grief and not anger exactly, more the tiredness of someone who'd carried weight that was never theirs to carry and had put it down and was now just tired. She went in. Davin looked smaller than she remembered. That was always the truth of returning to a place you'd escaped. The dimensions you'd lived inside of reduced, became proportional. He stood in the middle of the reception hall with 2 of his pack's senior men behind him and looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a calculation that had come out differently than expected. Ronan was at the far end of the hall. He did not speak. He told her he wouldn't, and she'd told him she didn't need him to. "Kalina," said Davin. "Alpha Creel," she said. Something moved through his face at the title, the formal distance of it. "You look—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. She let him stand in the stop for a moment, because she'd learned a long time ago that the people who'd held power over you did not get to set the tempo of the conversation just because they'd arrived. She'd learned that from a dead woman who'd had 30 years more wisdom than she'd managed to pass on before she ran out of time. "You sent my location to Corvin's network," she said, "through intermediaries, but the cipher trail is documented. The kingdom has the record." He opened his mouth. "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you what's already established." His jaw closed. "The legal question," said Ronan from the far end of the hall, speaking for the first time, "is whether that constitutes conspiracy in the assassination attempt, or whether it constitutes a lesser charge of material facilitation. The distinction matters for the proceedings." He paused. "The healer's testimony determines which charge applies." Davin looked at her. She'd thought about this. She'd spent a week thinking about it, going back and forth across it in the mornings when she walked the keep's eastern wall and let herself think without direction. She'd thought about what justice felt like versus what punishment felt like versus what she actually wanted, which was a question she'd been asking herself for 3 years and which had changed its answer repeatedly. What she wanted now was to be done. Not with the accounting. The accounting mattered, the record mattered, but with the carrying of it. With the part of herself that had been holding this man's actions in the place where she should have been holding something of her own. Material facilitation, she said. He didn't know the full scope. He knew enough to be negligent and not enough to be complicit. She looked at Davin. That's what the record should show. His face did something complicated. "The penalty for material facilitation," said Ronan, "is forfeiture of the territory held under royal charter, pending redistribution, and a 5-year restriction on Pack Alpha status." He said it the same way he said everything, level, without decoration. "It's not nothing." "No," she agreed, "it's not nothing." Davin said quietly, "Kalina." "Don't," she said again. Quieter this time. "Not a wall, just a fact. Whatever you're about to say, I don't need it. Keep it." She held his eyes for the last time, the absolute last time, she decided, that she was going to hold this man's eyes with the specific attention she'd been giving them. "I hope you do better." She turned and walked toward the hall's side exit and did not look back. Behind her she heard Ronan's voice, resuming the formal proceedings. She did not hear Davin's response. She was already through the door. That evening she stood on the keep's eastern wall and looked out at the valley and the beginning of the forest beyond it, at the particular shade of the sky an hour before dark, and she felt the leather pouch at her throat and thought about her grandmother. The pendant was back in the pouch, and the pouch was at her neck, and she'd put it there the morning after she'd woken from the sanctuary, and she knew this was not a temporary decision. Somewhere in the Keld Valley, the channels were clearing, running clean through the structure of an old place that had been built for exactly the purpose it was now fulfilling again, and the bloodline that had maintained those channels for generations was not extinct. She was standing on a wall in a kingdom that 6 weeks ago she'd been running away from, and she was not sure what to call what she was doing now. Staying was too simple. Deciding was too formal. She heard him come up the wall's steps before she heard him, which was a thing she'd noticed happening, some awareness of his approach that operated ahead of her conscious attention, a tuning she hadn't asked for and hadn't resisted. He came and stood beside her. Not 3 feet away, not the careful distance of the early conversations. 2 feet. The distance of people who'd pressed their hands against the same stone in the dark and survived what came after. "Court wants to formalize your status tomorrow," he said. "What status?" "That's what's under discussion." He looked out at the valley. "Fossey wants to restore the Voss bloodline to the historical record, which has implications for the sanctuary and its maintenance going forward." "I'm not a court appointment," she said. "No." He turned to look at her. "You're not. Whatever you are here, it's not that." She looked back at him. The frowning default had shifted over the weeks into something more variable. She could read more in his face now. The architecture had more rooms. She'd learned which tension in the jaw meant he was working on a problem, and which meant he was working on something he didn't have a name for yet. He was doing the second one. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm asking what you want." He said it directly, which she'd come to expect. Not what's practical, not what the court needs. What you want. She thought about that seriously because it deserved serious thought. She'd been asked that question 3 times in her life by people who meant it, and her grandmother had been one of them, and the accuracy of her answer had mattered on all 3 occasions. "I want the sanctuary maintained properly," she said, "not as a court function, as something I'm responsible for because I'm the person with the ability to do it right. I want the healer's post and dressed covered. There are people there who needed it before I left and need it now." She paused. "I want a door that locks from the inside." He said nothing, waiting. "And I want—" She stopped, restarted. "I want to see how this goes, without a predetermined answer, without being told what I am before I've had the chance to find out." The corner of his mouth moved, the ghost of the smile she'd catalogued. It was slightly less of a ghost than the first time. "Those are all achievable," he said. "Most things worth having are achievable," she said. "They're just not free." "No." He reached into his coat. He took out his hand and held it open, and in his palm was the leather pouch, which confused her for a moment because she could feel the pendant at her throat, the weight of it, and then she understood. This was his pouch, his own, and inside it was the shape of something flat and circular. "Fossey made a copy of the stamp," Ronan said. "He said the original should stay with you. He said—" A pause, something wry in the tone. "The king could make do with a reproduction." She looked at what he was holding, then she looked at him. "You've been carrying that for 3 weeks," she said. "I have." "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because I decided at some point in the Keld Valley that whatever you were willing to give this kingdom was going to give something back. And I didn't know what form that would take yet, but I wanted something of yours to be accounted for." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved off the valley below, and the sky continued its darkening, and somewhere in the keep a door opened and closed, and the ordinary life of a place that had almost stopped happening continued to happen. She thought about what her grandmother had said. The whole of it, both halves. Some gifts look like gifts until someone else decides what they're worth. And then you have to decide what it's worth to you. She'd spent her life being told what she was worth by people who had not earned the right to make that determination. She'd survived it. She'd come out of it knowing the difference between a number someone else put on you and the value you located in yourself through the work of staying alive and staying whole. This was something different. This was someone asking. She took the pouch from his hand. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the familiar shape. Then she put it in her coat pocket, against her left side, next to the original. "Tomorrow," she said, "I want to speak with Fossey about the sanctuary records. And I want the dress post formalized in writing before the court session, not after." "Done," he said. "And I want—" She looked out at the valley, at the dark coming in from the east. "To walk the eastern wall every morning without someone being sent to check on me." He looked at her. "You notice that," he said. "I notice everything," she said. "It's how I survived your kingdom for 6 weeks." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "That was concern, not surveillance." "I know the difference." She glanced at him. "I'm telling you I don't need the first one. I'm telling you I know the difference between them. That's not the same as saying I don't know what it was." He absorbed this in the way she'd come to recognize, fully, without deflection, the way a person absorbs something when they were genuinely rearranging their internal model around it. "All right," he said. They stood on the wall for a while after that without speaking, which had become possible somewhere in the past weeks. The silences between them had changed in quality, had become inhabited rather than tense, had become the kind of silence that 2 people built between them slowly, without noticing, through the accumulation of shared experience and the absence of performance. She thought about the dog in the back field and the warmth that had come up through her palms. The 9-year-old girl who discovered she could do something and had spent 17 years learning to keep it hidden. The woman who'd walked through the gray waste with her grandmother's pendant and no destination. The stranger on the ground with the targeted wound and the pulse that skipped like a stone across water. All of it connected. Not neatly. Life didn't connect neatly. It connected the way rivers connected, through erosion and time and the path of least resistance, revealing itself only in retrospect. But connected. The plague was over. The channels were clean. The conspiracy had names attached to it now, and names meant accountability, meant the thing could be seen in full rather than felt only as damage. Davin was diminished and documented and done. Her grandmother's bloodline was in the historical record under her living name. Every debt was in the process of being repaid. Not every wound was healed. She knew better than to expect that. Healing was not the same as closed. She'd learned that with her hands before she'd learned it with the rest of herself. Some things knit and left a seam you'd always feel when the weather changed. That was not failure. That was the record of what had been survived, written in the only material permanent enough to hold it. "Ronan," she said. "Yes." She thought about what she wanted to say, whether it was the kind of thing that needed to be said yet, or whether it needed more time to become itself before it was spoken into the air, where it would have to hold its own weight. She decided it needed more time. "Good night," she said. He looked at her with the expression she still didn't have a complete name for. Then he nodded, just once, the economy of a man who understood that some things were said in full by not yet being said. "Good night," he said. She walked the wall to the east stairs and went down into the keep, and behind her she heard him stay a moment longer at the parapet before he followed. And the distance between the two sets of footsteps was the distance of people who were, with great care and appropriate caution, beginning to understand what they were to each other. Not arrived. Beginning. Some things were worth the time it took to get them right. Kaylina Voss had learned the hard way to know the difference between what was free and what was worth paying for. She had paid in years in exile in a gift she'd kept hidden so long it had almost forgotten how to breathe, and she had come out the other side of it with her grandmother's pendant and her own name and a door that locked from the inside. What came next was hers to determine. She determined to get some sleep. Tomorrow there were records to read, a post to formalize, and the first morning walk of the rest of a life she was, for the first time in a very long time, looking forward to. The keep settled around her, stone and smoke, and the ordinary sounds of a place that was alive. The channels in the Keld Valley ran clean through the dark. The pendant rested against her sternum, warm from her body. Every future secured, every debt repaid, every wound, finally and imperfectly, on its way toward something that was not forgetting but was close enough to peace to call it by that name.